Hey guys, we're going to be talking about absolutism and constitutionalism. Okay, it's really kind of hard to say at times. Absolutism and constitutionalism. Okay, the world be a changing. Okay, so we got to be understanding these two concepts. So we're going to start off with absolutism. Okay, much of the history of the 17th and 18th century Europe is a history basically of the struggle of control between Great Britain and France. Okay, Great Britain and France basically are not only represented by two different systems of government. One's constitutional monarch, and the other's an absolutist state, which would be France. There are uh, other differences that we have to look at as well. One, okay, that you should know, and again, during this lecture, guys, you should be taking notes. You should things that I'm saying, and also things that are on the screen that will help you. Now, anything that's on these, I should have said this a minute ago, but anything that's on these are testable. They can be on your test, especially with your essay test. Big hint, guys, this stuff is on your essay test, so I'll make sure you know it. Okay, so let's continue. Okay, some of the other differences between, especially between France and Great Britain, are the issue of religion. My phone's going off. Okay, hold on a second. I'll just deaden that down. Okay, the issue of religious freedom, I should say. Okay, the role of gentry and nobility, and also the role that the Army and the Navy play in both of these countries. Okay, now France has an additional problem because it's faced with constant threat from the Habsburg countries around here, such as Spain, Spanish Netherlands, Milan, and northern Italy, Luxembourg, and also the Austrian Empire, which also includes the old Holy Roman Empire. Yeah, they're still around, guys. So they're still part of it. So these foreign threats keep France busy until the War of Spanish Succession. We're going to talk about that a little bit later on, which actually ends up making Spain an ally. And it finally breaks that ugly little thing that of having to worry about the Habsburgs encircling and leaving France free to try to dominate. So at least France free, and they get the charity. Hey, leaving France, leaving France. So they can concentrate more on Great Britain as their competitor than all these other little issues that they were having, at least at one time, were having to deal with. Okay, so now we end up with the concept of the divine monarchy. Okay, and this basically is that the monarchs are gods actually chosen on earth. So their monarchs are God's chosen ones on earth. And you have to remember that this is the concept, and that's what you got to understand. They're not gods themselves, but they are God's chosen ones on earth. Now, there's a similar theme to this because it kind of flies in the fact that especially with the Catholicism, that the Pope is the chosen one. He's God's right hand man, at least referring to the Catholics anyway. Okay, so they are, they believe that they have these monarchs actually believe they have they saw themselves as absolute. Okay, that they are ordained by God. And James the First is one that really kicks us off real die hard. And we'll get to James in a little while. We'll talk about him too. So remember that at least they believed that they were ordained by God to lead. So that's an important theme that we have. Okay, now we have Louis the 14th. He actually is an absolute monarch. He takes the throne in about 1643 as a young boy. He's about 5 years old when he takes the throne. And he firmly believes in the divine right of kings. By the time he's in his early 20s, he's gained nearly absolute power as king of France, and I mean absolute power. When asked about the limits of his power, Louis XIV basically stated, "I am the state." In other words, nothing else mattered, nothing else. And the state is referring to France. So I am France, I am the state, nothing else matters. As a result, okay, he continues the advancement of the French monarchy, which had begun really begins earnest under Francis I. We're not going to cover Francis right now, though. So to this, he needed to demonstrate to the French nobility which had, long squabbled over, power and dominance and everything else. So, how are you going to do that? Well, he comes up with a great idea. Okay, he accomplishes this by actually building a palace known as at Versailles, and obliging the nobility to come to him instead of himself traveling around France, to preserve order with his own presence. So in other words, he builds this elaborate palace and invites all these people to come to him instead of him traveling around the country, showing off his presence. I'm here, I'm king, I got your back, or any of those concepts. He invites all these people to come, and as you can see in this lower part of the picture, this entourage coming into the palace, into the Versailles. Now, the palace, unfortunately, costs him about one half year's royal reverence to build. Now, the magnific system of the palace, of the grounds of Versailles, had these numerous symbols all over. Louis XIV has them put them up. They were known as the sun symbols all around the palace, which people began to associate Louis XIV as the Sun King. And that almost sounds like old Egyptian, like the sun god, like a pharaoh. So he ends up, and he actually embraces this thing as well. So, here the nobility, are coming to him to pay homage to him, recognizing his power as king, as the state. Now, all these nobilities will show up, and the concept you often read is that the nobility were crammed into tiny rooms with, little sanitation, even the drinking water froze at night in the winter. Oh, man, poor you. When you look at this picture of one of the rooms, cramped rooms in the palace, it doesn't look very cramped. But, all the entourage of a particular noble would be crammed into this one room. But the thing was that the social and political advancements was at Versailles, so everybody came. Versailles is an example, actually, of the secular Baroque style of architecture. Okay, it's designed to overawe people. It's like, wow, this is huge, it's beautiful, it's elaborate, it's everything. I mean, it just kind of awed people. So everybody came here, even though it was like, a pain in their rear ends. They have to travel all the way to Versailles to see the king, to get audience with the king. But they came anyway because of the fact that it benefited them to do so. So you have to, even when you're looking at this picture, it's not really that cramped. But this is kind of a picture of like what he mirrors this whole concept. As in the Catholic Church, we're building these large, massive cathedrals laced through gold and elaborate decorations, statues all over the place. So Louis XIV, mirrors this. I mean, he is Catholic, so I mean, he actually mirrors this concept that the rest of them have as well. Okay, and the reality is also is that, besides that thing, we actually later on, when we designed Washington, designed it to some degree on the elaborate scale of Versailles. If you go to Washington D.C., it's the layout of Washington D.C. is extremely elaborate. It looks like almost like the picture that you just saw with Versailles. I mean, it's this concept of entering a great city, a great capital of an empire. Maybe that's not what we exactly intended to be, but we do it later on anyway. So you have this concept of all these nobles in Versailles. They're wasting time sitting around playing cards and engaging in a bunch of dances and spending money lavishly on each other. Now, Louis's idea was so successful in taming or defranchising the French nobility that the palace idea was adopted by other monarchs in France, other monarchs in Europe, interested in creating a true absolute state. So he actually becomes a mirror to others, such as Peter the Great, to the Habsburgs on the right, on the left, the Habsburgs. I couldn't find a really good picture of Eva Habsburg, but this is the family tree, the Habsburgs. So they all try to manipulate or try to mirror Louis XIV's massive estate, the concept of a great giant empire, impressive empire. Now, the question is, how do you pay for this? Okay, because it's pretty elaborate. So Lewis actually pays for this by he employs John Bastille Colbert, which we've already talked about in class, as his chief financial minister. Now, he asked him to vigorously pursue a policy of mercantilism to increase the wealth and the power of a state. Now, we know that Colbert did not invent the theory of mercantilism, but he does use it to provide Lewis with the robust economy of his plans of which he demanded. And the wealth of nations, according to the 18th century, was based on, nations' gold supply, the ability to acquire more gold. A country would need favorable balance of trade. Remember that comment we used before. The concept of selling more overseas than bought, the export more than you import, and in making the country more self-sufficient. Remember, the key element of mercantilism is that the country must be self-sufficient. Now, unfortunately, high tariffs are used to keep out foreign competition, and colonies are absolutely a must to produce whatever France doesn't have, like any other country that was mercantilist. And they had to become a powerful merchant marine. Remember the large navy concept to get your goods back and forth. So you had to have that strong navy. And this, however, presented a direct threat to France's archenemy at the time, was Great Britain, who had already staked out positions in as a premier force of the sea, especially after defeating the Spanish. And they used things called the Navigation Acts, which you'll learn more when you get to AP U.S. history or you take regular U.S. history, and how this actually helped thrive the Great Britain's economy as well. Now, there's a problem with this, though. Part of it is the renovation of the Edict of Nantes. Okay, now Colbert's success of the French economy basically gets undone by the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685. The Edict of Nantes had actually been passed during the wars of religion that were taking place, and it guaranteed actually religious toleration for the French Protestants, who at the time actually were basically known as Huguenots. So now, despite the edict having been passed, Protestants had been the victims of government harassment throughout the 17th century, but even more so after 1679, when Louis decreed that there would be one law and one religion, and that was his Huguenots. So unfortunately, he kind of backfires himself. So what happens? Well, because of this, the Edict of Nantes being revoked, about 300,000 Frenchmen leave. They carry with them their skills, they carry with them their money. Even more so, they carried a hatred of Louis XIV and the concept of absolutism. Now, feeding into and this all feeds into the British Anglicans that thought the Catholics, once in power, like James II, could not be trusted and preserve religious toleration. And it plays right into the concept of what the British were trying to do at the time. Now, Louis XIV and his French military, or as he liked to call himself, the Sun King, was not content with mere economic domination of Europe, unfortunately, for him. So Louis's army, he would employ directly, which was employed directly by him, the king, not the nobles, whom actually he actually distrusted a lot. And the officers would be French, even though many of the men that served as officers for Louis XIV were actually mercenaries. Okay, he found a way to feed his army, rather than have them live off the land. So the French armies rarely ever plundered the countryside. Although to avoid doing so, they often sacrificed speed. So they had to drag all their supplies along with them. Now, one of the positive things that Louis has actually looked at doing is that he actually builds a hospital for his injured soldiers. He actually builds a hospital in Paris. And on the premise that soldiers they would always know that they were being cared for. So this lovely king would actually, if you got injured, fighting for him, he would take care of you, and he would, make sure that you were completely taken care of. The concept was be that the soldiers would, of course, be more willing to fight. But the area that was the most advanced during this time period was artillery and engineers, who once actually had to know what one was doing. And it's here that even the sons of the middle class and the lowest of the low nobility rose rapidly. And most famous, of course, example being Napoleon in the next about the next century or so. Okay, and moving right along. Okay, so now, uh, unfortunately, the army was huge. So he builds this huge, humongous army. He never allowed the army to fall below 200,000, and its full strength it would be around 400,000 or so. Um, Now he had to pay these people because a lot of, like I said, were mercenaries. He had to feed them. He had to house them, and unfortunately, because of that, he creates a huge drain on the French. Wow, long day. French tax receipts. So unfortunately, uh, he drains all this revenue out of France. Okay, now Lewis's army does not actually live up to uh, what it was supposed to, the expectations. And we have the Spanish, like I said, more about earlier, what I said, we're going to talk more about the Spanish succession. Now, during the Spanish succession that takes place between 1701 and 1703, this huge army fails to distinguish itself. France actually loses this war. It's a debacle on France's part. But there is a positive side that comes out of this. As part of his drive to break out of his Habsburg encirclement, okay, Louis's scheme to have a relative of his named as the Spanish throne. Um, the Spanish king's son was well, excuse me, not the Spanish king's son. The Spanish king, okay, was fairly sick. Many people believe he actually was going insane, and he was hoping that this king was going to die very soon. So Louis plots to have one of his own relatives named to the Spanish throne. Now this robs Austria of a throne that she believed belonged to their family trees, the Habsburgs, and would have secured peace along with France. One area of which now, at least if Louis XIV is successful, it's an area he doesn't have to worry about being attacked from if he is successful doing this. So the war ends up pitting France and Spain against Austria and Great Britain, who saw the opportunity to damage France by supporting Austrian claims. So it actually ends up putting two people that weren't technically allies at the time, but it ends up putting them together. So France and Spain becomes connected with one another and does for quite some time. And it also puts Austria and Great Britain together. And that one doesn't last very long, but it does have some effects. Okay, so France, as I said, loses the war. The army is poorly financed. It's badly equipped, despite all the money that Louis poured into it. France also was hurt by a terrible famine that had took place in 1709. So France technically loses this war. The war ends due to the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, which was less of a victory than Britain had won on the battlefield. Philip, okay, who was Louis's relative, actually does become king of Spain on the condition that the Spanish and the French crowns would never unite. So that's a key concept, that they can never unite with each other. But France was obliged to give up, okay, things that they didn't particularly want to give up originally, such as Newfoundland, which Britain had used as a staging area later on for a war that takes place in Canada. And Spain had to give up Gibraltar, I cannot say that word, the only entrance into or exit from the Mediterranean until, of course, the Suez Canal gets built in 1869, a lot longer. So the war was far different from what was the 30 Years' War, which was fought for most of the 18th century by professional armies. Now the masses could not occur. The masses would not occur later in the French Revolution. Okay, so thus people were more involved in this war. The main people involved, the main citizens are only involved indirectly, so they're not directly involved. So, because you have the mercenaries that are actually running this war to a large part, but this war ends. Okay, so now the outcome of this treaty. Okay, Philip, Louis's relative, as I said, he does become king of Spain. France gives up, as I said, Newfoundland, so you should know that. Long-standing rivalry between France and Spain, replaced with a strong alliance between them and the two most powerful countries in Europe. France and Great Britain actually begin to seize control of the continent. So this battle literally becomes between Great Britain and France of who's going to control Europe. So that's that part. Okay, now what does the impact of Louis XIV have literally on France? Well, one thing is that Louis XIV does indeed unify France. He dies in Louis XIV dies in 1715, but he does unify it as it never had been unified before. But unfortunately, by the same token, he leaves her demoralized and I cannot say that word. In a lot of debt. That's a good way of putting it. Because of the wars that he had lost. Okay. He also sold many of his offices, thus exempting more people from taxation. And, he raised taxes rates on those that could not really afford the system or afford to pay the taxes. And in the long run, he basically majorly discredits the concept of absolutism or allowing a king to have absolute power. So, indeed, the fact is that later on, the 7 Years' War displays France as weak. So many countries actually end up viewing France as a very weak country after France. So it kind of sounds like an oxymoron saying that they were unified internally, but they're not viewed as unified or they're not viewed as strong by other countries, in a large part because of their debt, their weakness, and their weak showing in the Spanish succession. Okay, now the 7 Years' War, the French, also known as the French and Indian War, takes place between 1756 and 1763. So by the middle of the 18th century, England had moved to neutralize France as a dominant force on the European continent. So you remember this rival is there. So to this end, she stabilizes or subsidizes allies in Europe. First Austria, as we mentioned a minute ago, and then Prussia, to keep France busy fighting in Europe while she concentrated on conquering colonies overseas and also destroying France's commerce. Now Britain was able to put about 40,000 troops into the New World when the French actually could not. France divided her energies playing power politics in Europe while competing with the British overseas. But the fact was that the British actually saw where this battle, where the major benefit was going to come from, which was going to be in the New World, if you controlled the New World. So they concentrated a lot of forces into the New World. France was primary a land power, while Britain, as we stated before, especially after the defeat of the Spanish Armada, becomes a large naval power. And by 1750, British warships outnumber the French by about 2 to 1. And about 1759, the French ships any ship that tried to leave port, any French ship that tried to leave port, the British would just simply decimate it, destroy it, sink it, capture it, whatever it had to do, and prevented France from actually getting any major hold in the New World. And by doing this, France further bankrupted herself, eventually, bringing on this whole revolutionary concept. Now, the 7 Years' War, is as it is known in our country as the French Indian War, saw new alliances with Britain and Prussia, as I said, against France and Austria, showing again that alliances in Europe are almost always temporary and designed to achieve only certain limited goals. Now, William Pitt the Elder gave Britain her new war strategy, funneling money to Prussia while Britain concentrated on preventing Frenchmen and supplies from reaching overseas possessions. So it was pretty smart on the concept of them. While well-equipped British armies thus conquered isolated, poorly fed, and rarely paid French garrisons that were in the New World. And as a result of this war, England actually wins Canada and India, while France loses possessions in the mainland of North America. France is devastated in North America and actually pretty wiped out anything east of the Mississippi, and the area which would provoke eventually the American Revolution as well. So, moreover, England had beaten France decisively for the first time in a long time and was able to devote herself to American colonies, whom she discovered, okay, invading taxes, and we get into the American Revolution much later. Um, but this has the second part, then what we're going to talk about is the Glorious Revolution and the English Constitutionalism, which I'm going to say for a second part, just so that the video is not too long and you can kind of go back and don't have to listen to a large part. So I'm going to stop here and I'll continue part 2 in a little while. Okay, so I'm going to stop this thing as soon as I possibly can, and we're done.